Part 2 of Chapter 7 of the Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Translated by William Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. Part 2 of Chapter 7. B. Quantity. Pure quantity. Quantity is pure being, where the mode or character is no longer taken as one with the being itself, but explicitly put as superseded or indifferent. The expression magnitude especially marks determinate quantity, and is for that reason not a suitable name for quantity in general. Mathematics usually define magnitude as what can be increased or diminished. This definition has the defect of containing the thing to be defined over again, but it may serve to show that the category of magnitude is explicitly understood to be changeable and indifferent, so that in spite of its being altered by an increased extension or intension, the thing, a house for example, does not cease to be a house and red to be red. The absolute is pure quantity. This point of view is upon the whole the same as when the absolute is defined to be matter, in which, though form undoubtedly is present, the form is characteristic of no importance one way or another. Quantity too constitutes the main characteristic of the absolute, when the absolute is regarded as absolute in difference and only admitting of quantitative distinction. Otherwise, pure space, time, etc. may be taken as examples of quantity. If we allow ourselves to regard the real as whatever fills up space and time, it matters not with what. The mathematical definition of magnitude, as what may be increased or diminished, appears at first sight to be more plausible and perspicuous than the exposition of the notion in the present section. When closely examined, however, it involves under cover of presuppositions and images the same elements as appear in the notion of quantity reached by the method of logical development. In other words, when we say that the notion of magnitude lies in the possibility of being increased or diminished, we state that magnitude, or more correctly quantity, as distinguished from quality, is characteristic of such kind that the characterized thing is not in the least affected by any change in it. What then, it may be asked, is the fault which we have to find in this definition? It is that to increase and to diminish is the same thing as to characterize magnitude otherwise. If this aspect were then an adequate account of it, quantity would be described merely as whatever can be altered. But quality is no less than quantity open to alteration, and the distinction here given between quantity and quality is expressed by the saying increase or diminution. The meaning being that, towards whatever side the determination of magnitude be altered, the thing still remains what it is. One remark more. Throughout philosophy we do not seek merely for correct, still less for plausible definitions, whose correctness appeals directly to the popular imagination. We seek approved or verified definitions, the content of which is not assumed merely as given, but is seen and known to warrant itself because warranted by the free self-evolution of thought. To apply this to the present case, however correct and self-evident the definition of quantity usual in mathematics may be, it will still fail to satisfy the wish to see how far this particular thought is founded in universal thought, and in that way necessary. This difficulty, however, is not the only one. If quantity is not reached through the action of thought, but taken uncritically from our generalized image of it, we are liable to exaggerate the range of its validity, or even to raise it to the height of an absolute category. And that such a danger is real, we see when the title of exact science is restricted to those sciences, the object of which can be submitted to mathematical calculation. Here we have another trace of the bad metaphysics, which replace the concrete idea by partial and inadequate categories of understanding. Our knowledge would be in a very awkward predicament if such objects as freedom, law, morality, or even God himself, because they cannot be measured and calculated, or expressed in mathematical formula, were to be reckoned beyond the reach of exact knowledge, and we had to put up with a vague generalized image of them, leaving their details or particulars to the will. The pernicious consequences to which such a theory gives rise in practice are at once evident, and this mere mathematical view, which identifies with the ideas one of its specialized stages, viz. Quantity, is no other than the principle of materialism. Witness the history of the scientific modes of thought, especially in France since the middle of last century. Matter, in the abstract is just what, though of course there is form in it, has that form only as an indifferent and external attribute. The present explanation would be utterly misconceived if it were supposed to disparage mathematics. By calling the quantitative characteristic merely external and indifferent, we provide no excuse for indolence and superficiality, nor do we assert that the quantitative characteristic may be left to mind themselves, or at least require no very careful handling. Quantity, of course, is a stage of the idea, and as such it must have its due, first as a logical category, and then, in the world of objects, natural as well as spiritual. Still, even so, there soon emerges the different importance attaching to the category of quantity according as its object belong to the natural or the spiritual world. For in nature, where the forms of the idea is to be other than, and at the same time outside itself, greater importance is for that very reason attached to quantity than in the spiritual world, the world of free inwardness. No doubt we regard even spiritual facts under a quantitative point of view, but it is at once apparent that in speaking of God as a Trinity, the number 3 has by no means the same prominence as when we consider the 3 dimensions of space or the 3 sides of a triangle, the fundamental feature of which last is just to be a surface bounded by 3 lines. Even inside the realm of nature we find the same distinction of greater or less importance of quantitative features. In the inorganic world, quantity plays, so to say, a more prominent part than in the organic. Even in organic nature, when we distinguish mechanical functions from what are called chemical and in the narrower sense physical, there is the same difference. Mechanics is of all the branches of science confessedly that in which the aid of mathematics can be least dispensed with, where indeed we cannot take one step without them. On that account mechanics is regarded next to mathematics as the science par excellence. Which leads us to repeat the remark about the coincidence of materialist and the exclusively mathematical point of view. After all that has been said, we cannot but hold it, in the interest of exact and thorough knowledge, one of the most hurtful prejudices to seek all distinction and determinateness of objects merely in quantitative considerations. Mind, to be sure, is more than nature, and the animal is more than the plant. But we know very little of these objects and the distinction between them. If a more and a less is enough for us, and if we do not proceed to comprehend them in their peculiar, that is their qualitative character. Quantity, as we saw, has 2 sources, the exclusive unit and the identification or equalization of these units. When we look, therefore, at its immediate relation to self, or at the characteristic of self-sameness made explicit by attraction, quantity is continuous magnitude. But when we look at the other characteristic, the one implied in it, it is discrete magnitude. Still, continuous quantity has also a certain discreteness, being but a continuity of the many, and discrete quantity is no less continuous, its continuity being the one or unit, that is, the self-same point of the many ones. Continuous and discrete magnitude, therefore, must not be supposed 2 species of magnitude, as if the characteristic of the one did not attach to the other. The only distinction between them is that the same whole of quantity is at the same time explicitly put under the one, at another under the other of its characteristics. The antinomy of space, of time, or of matter, which discusses the question of their being divisible forever, or of consisting of indivisible units, just means that we maintain quantity as at one time discrete, at another continuous. If we explicitly invest time, space, or matter with the attribute of continuous quantity alone, they are divisible ad infinitum. When, on the contrary, they are invested with the attribute of discrete quantity, they are potentially divided already and consist of indivisible units. The one view is as inadequate as the other. Quantity, as the proximate result of being for self, involves the 2 sides in the process of the latter, attraction and repulsion, as constitutive elements of its own idea. It is consequently continuous as well as discrete. Each of these 2 elements involves the other also, and hence there is no such thing as merely continuous or merely discrete quantity. We may speak of the 2 as the 2 particular and opposite species of magnitude, but that is merely the result of our abstracting reflection, which in viewing definite magnitudes waives now the one, now the other of the elements, contained in inseparable unity in the notion of quantity. Thus it may be said, the space occupied by this room is a continuous magnitude, and the 100 men assembled in it form a discrete magnitude, and yet the space is continuous and discrete at the same time. Hence we speak of points of space, or we divide space at a certain length, into so many feet, inches, etc., which can be done only on the hypothesis that space is also potentially discrete. Similarly, on the other hand, the discrete magnitude made up of 100 men is also continuous, and the circumstance on which this continuity depends is the common element, the species of man which pervades all the individuals and unites them with each other. Quantum, how much. Quantity, essentially invested with the exclusionist character which it involves, is quantum, or how much, i.e. limited quantity. Quantum is, as it were, the determinate being of quantity. whereas mere quantity corresponds to abstract being, and the degree, which is next to be considered, corresponds to being for self. As for the details of the advance from mere quantity to quantum, it is founded on this, that whilst the mere quantity, the distinction, as a distinction of continuity and discreteness, is at first only implicit, in a quantum the distinction is actually made, so that the quantity in general now appears as distinguished or limited. But in this way the quantum breaks up at the same time into an indefinite multitude of quanta or definite magnitudes. Each of these definite magnitudes, as distinguished from the others, forms a unity, while on the other hand viewed per se, it is a many. And when that is done, the quantum is described as number. In number, the quantum reaches its development and perfect mode. Like the one, the medium in which it exists, number involves two qualitative factors or functions, enumeration or sum, which depend on the factor discreteness, and unity, which depends on continuity. In arithmetic, the several kinds of operation are usually presented as accidental modes of dealing with numbers. If necessity and meaning is to be found in these operations, it must be by a principle, and that must come from the characteristic elements in the notion of number itself. This principle must here be briefly exhibited. The characteristic elements are enumeration on the one hand, and unity on the other, which together constitute number. But unity, when applied to empirical numbers, is only the equality of these numbers. Hence the principle of arithmetical operations must be to put numbers in ratio of unity and sum or amount, and to elicit the equality of these two modes. The ones, or the numbers themselves, are indifferent towards each other, and hence the unity into which they are translated by the arithmetical operation takes the aspect of an external colligation. All reckoning is therefore making up the tale, and the difference between the species of it lies only in the qualitative constitution of the numbers of which we make up the tale. The principle for this constitution is given by the way we fix unity and enumeration. Numeration comes first, what we may call making number, a colligation of as many units as we please. But to get to a species of calculation, it is necessary that what we count up should be numbers already, and no longer a mere unit. First, and as they naturally come to hand, numbers are quite vaguely numbers in general, so on the whole unequal. The colligation or telling the tale of these is addition. The second point of view under which we regard numbers is as equal, so that they make one unity, and of such there is an enumeration or sum before us. To tell the tale of these is multiplication. It makes no matter in the process how the function of sum and unity are distributed between the two numbers or factors of the product. Either may be sum and either may be unity. The third and final point of view is the equality of sum, amount, and unity. To number together numbers when so characterized is involution, and in the first instance raising them to the square power. To raise the number to a higher power means in point of form to go on multiplying a number with itself an indefinite amount of times. Since this third type of calculation exhibits the complete equality of the sole existing distinction in number, viz. The distinction between sum or amount and unity, there can be no more than these three modes of calculation. Corresponding to the integration, we have the dissolution of numbers according to the same features. Hence, besides the three species mentioned, which may to that extent be called positive, there are three negative species of arithmetical operation. Number in general is the quantum in its complete specialization. Hence we may employ it not only to determine what we call discrete, but what are called continuous magnitudes as well. For that reason, even geometry must call in the aid of number, when it is required to specify definite figurations of space and their ratios. The limit in a quantum is identical with the whole of the quantum itself, as in itself multiple. The limit is extensive magnitude, as in the simple determinateness, qualitative simplicity. It is the intensive magnitude or degree. The distinction between continuous and discrete magnitude differs from that between extensive and intensive in the circumstance that the former apply to the quantity in general, while the latter apply to the limit or determinateness of it as such. Intensive and extensive magnitude are not, any more than the other, two species of which the one involves a character not possessed by the other. What is extensive magnitude is just as much intensive and vice versa. Intensive magnitude or degree is in its notion distinct from extensive magnitude or the quantum. It is therefore inadmissible to refuse, as many do, to recognize this distinction, and without scruple to identify the two forms of magnitude. They are so identified in physics when difference of specific gravity is explained by saying that a body with a specific gravity twice of another contains within the same space twice as many material parts or atoms as the other. So with heat and light, if the various degrees of temperature and brilliancy were to be explained by the greater or less number of particles or molecules of heat and light. No doubt the physicists who employ such a mode of explanation usually excuse themselves when they are remonstrated with on its untenableness by saying that the expression is without prejudice to the confessedly unknowable essence of such phenomena, and employed merely for greater convenience. The greater convenience is meant to point to the easier application of the calculus, but it is hard to see why intensive magnitudes, having as they do a definite numerical expression of their own, should not be as convenient for calculation as extensive magnitudes. If convenience be all that is desired, surely it would be more convenient to banish calculation and thought altogether. A further point against the apology offered by physicists is that to engage in explanations of this kind is to overstep the sphere of perception and experience, and resort to the realm of metaphysics, and of what at other times would be called idle or even pernicious speculation. It is certainly a fact of experience that if one of two purses filled with shillings is twice as heavy as the other, the reason must be that the one contains, say, 200 and the other only 100 shillings. These pieces of money we can see and feel with our senses. Atoms, molecules, and the like are beyond the range of sensuous perception, and thought alone can decide whether they are admissible and have a meaning. But it is abstract understanding which stereotypes the factor of multeity, involved in the notion of being for self, in the shape of atoms, and adopts it as an ultimate principle. It is the same abstract understanding which, in present instance, at equal variance in unprejudiced perception and with real concrete thought, regards extensive magnitudes as the sole form of quantity, and, where intensive magnitudes occur, does not recognise them in their own character, but makes a violent attempt by a wholly untenable hypothesis to reduce the extensive magnitudes. Among the charges made against modern philosophy, one is heard more than another. Modern philosophy, it is said, reduces everything to identity, hence its nickname, the philosophy of identity. But the present discussion may teach that it is philosophy and philosophy alone which insists on distinguishing what is logically as well as in experience different, while the professed devotees of experience are the people who erect abstract identity into the chief principle of knowledge. It is their philosophy which might be more appropriately termed one of identity, because it is quite correct that there are no merely extensive and merely intensive magnitudes, just as little as there are merely continuous and merely discrete magnitudes. The two characteristics of quantity are not opposed as independent kinds. Every intensive magnitude is also extensive and vice versa. Thus a certain degree of temperature is an intensive magnitude, which has a perfectly simple sensation corresponding to it as such. If we look at a thermometer, we find this degree of temperature as a certain expansion of the column of mercury corresponding to it, with extensive magnitude changes simultaneously with the temperature or intensive magnitude. The case is similar in the world of mind. A more intensive character has a wider range with its effects than a less intensive. In degree, the notion of quantum is explicitly put. It is magnitude as indifferent on its own account and simple, but in such a way that the character or modal being, which makes it a quantum, lies quite outside it in other magnitudes. In this contradiction, where the independent, indifferent limit is absolute externality, the infinite quantitative progression is made explicit, in immediacy which immediacy veers round into its counterpart, into mediation, the passing beyond and over the quantum just laid down, and vice versa. Number is a thought, but thought in its complete self-externalization. Because it is a thought, it does not belong to perception, but it is a thought which is characterized by the externality of perception. Not only therefore may the quantum be increased or diminished without end, the very notion of quantum is thus pushed out and out beyond itself. The infinite quantitative progression is only the meaningless repetition of one and the same contradiction which attaches to the quantum, both generally and when explicitly invested with its special character as degree. Touching the futility of enunciation, this contradiction in the form of infinite progression, Zeno, as quoted by Aristotle, rightly says, it is the same to say a thing once and to say it for ever. If we follow the usual definition of the mathematicians, and say that magnitude is what can be increased or diminished, there may be nothing to urge against the correctness of the perception on which it is founded. But the question remains how we come to assume such a capacity of increase or diminution. If we simply appeal for an answer to experience, we try an unsatisfactory course, because apart from the fact that we should merely have a material image of magnitude and not the thought of it, magnitude will come out as a bare possibility of increasing or diminishing, and we should have no key to the necessity for its exhibiting this behaviour. In the way of our logical evolution, on the contrary, quantity is obviously a grade in the process of the self-determining thought, and it has been shown that it lies in the very notion of quantity to shoot out beyond itself. In that way the increase or diminution, of which we have heard, is not merely possible, but necessary. The quantitative infinite progression is what the reflective understanding usually relies upon when it is engaged with the general question of infinity. The same thing, however, holds good of this progression, as was already remarked on the occasion of the qualitatively infinite progression, and was then said it is not the expression of a true, but of a wrong infinity. It never gets further than a bare ought, and thus really remains within the limits of finitude. The quantitative form of this infinite progression, which Spinoza rightly calls a mere imaginary infinity, infinitum imaginationis, is an image often employed by poets, such as Haller and Klopstock, to depict the infinity, not of nature merely, but even of God himself. Thus we find Haller in a famous description of God's infinity saying: Ich häufe ungeheure Zahlen, Gebirge Millionen auf, ich setze Seit auf Seit und Welt auf Welt zuhauf. Und wenn ich von der grauen Ho mit Schwindel wieder nach dir seh, ich alle Macht der Zahl, bemerk zu 1000-mal noch nicht ein Teil von dir. I heap up monstrous numbers, mountains of millions. I pile time upon time, and world on top of world. And when from the awful height I cast dizzy look towards thee, all the power of number, multiplied 1,000 times, is not yet one part of thee. Here then we meet in the first place that continual extrusion of quantity, and especially of number beyond itself, which Kant describes as eerie, and the only really eerie thing about it is the wearisome of ever fixing and anon unfixing a limit, without advancing a single step. The same poet, however, well adds to that description of false infinity the closing line: Ich zieh sie ab und du liegst ganz vor mir. These I remove, and thou liest all before me. Which means that the true infinite is more than a mere world beyond the finite, and that we, in order to become conscious of it, must renounce that progressus in infinitum. Pythagoras, as is well known, philosophized in numbers, and conceived number as a fundamental principle of things. To the ordinary mind, this view must at first glance seem an utter paradox, perhaps a mere craze. What then are we to think of it? To answer this question we must, in the first place, remember that the problem of philosophy consists in tracing back things to thoughts, and of course to definite thoughts. Now number is undoubtedly a thought. It is the thought nearest the sensible, or more precisely expressed, it is the thought of the sensible itself, if we take the sensible to mean what is many and in reciprocal exclusion. The attempt to apprehend the universe as number is therefore the first step to metaphysics. In the history of philosophy, Pythagoras, as we know, stands between the Ionian philosophers and the Eleatics. While the former, as Aristotle says, never got beyond viewing the essence as mere material, and the latter, especially Parmenides, advanced as far as pure thought. In the shape of being, the principle of the Pythagorean philosophy forms, as it were, the bridge from the sensible to the supersensible. We may gather from this what is to be said of those who suppose that Pythagoras undoubtedly went too far, when he conceived the essence of things as mere number. It is true, they admit, that we can number things, but they contend things are far more than mere numbers. In what respect are they more? The ordinary sensuous consciousness, from its own point of view, would not hesitate to answer the question by handing us over the sensuous perception and remarking that things are not merely numbers, but also visible, odorous, palpable, etc. In the phrase of modern times, the fault of Pythagoras would be described as the excess of idealism. As may be gathered from what has been said on the historical position of the Pythagorean school, the real state of the case is quite the reverse. Let it be conceded that things are more than mere numbers, but the meaning of that admission must be that the bare thought of number is still insufficient to enunciate the definite notion or essence of things. Instead of saying that Pythagoras went too far with his philosophy of number, it would be nearer to the truth to say that he did not go far enough, and in fact the Eleatics were the first to take the furthest step into pure thought. Besides, even if there are not things, there are states of things, and phenomena of nature altogether, the character of which mainly rests on definite numbers and proportions. This is especially the case with the difference of tones and their harmonic concord, which, according to a well-known tradition, first suggested to Pythagoras to conceive the essence of things as number. Though it is unquestionably important to science to trace back these phenomena to the definite numbers on which they are based, it is wholly inadmissible to view the characterization by thought as a whole as merely numerical. We may certainly fear ourselves prompted to associate the most general characteristics of thought with the numbers, saying 1 is the simple and immediate, 2 is the difference and mediation, and 3 the unity of both of these. Such associations, however, are purely external. There is nothing in mere numbers to make them express these definite thoughts. With every step in this method, the more arbitrary grows the association of definite numbers with definite thoughts. Thus we may view 4 as the unity of 1 and 3, and the thoughts associated with them. But 4 is just as much the double of 2. Similarly 9, not merely the square of 3, but the sum of 8 and 1, of 7 and 2, and so on. To attach, as do some secret societies of modern times, importance to all sorts of numbers and figures is to some extent innocent amusement, but it is also a sign of the deficiency of intellectual resource. These numbers, it is said, conceal a profound meaning and suggest a deal to think about. But the point in philosophy is not what you may think, but what you do think, and the genuine air of thought is to be sought in thought itself, and not in arbitrarily selected symbols. That the quantum is the independent character, is external to itself, is what constitutes quality. In that externality it is itself and referred connectively to itself. There is a union in it of externality, i.e. of the quantitative, and of independency, being for self, the qualitative. The quantum, when explicitly put thus in its own self, is the quantitative ratio, a mode of being which, while in its exponent it is an immediate quantum, it is also mediation, viz. The reference of some one quantum to another, forming the two sides of the ratio. But the two quanta are not reckoned as their immediate value. Their value is only in this relation. The quantitative infinite progression appears at first as a continual extrusion of number beyond itself. On looking closer, it is, however, apparent that this progression quantity returns to itself, and for meaning of this progression, so far as it goes, is in fact that number is determined by number. This gives the quantitative ratio. Take, for example, the ratio 2 to 4. Here we have two magnitudes, not counted in their several immediate values, in which we are not concerned with their mutual relations. The relation of the two terms, the exponent of the ratio, is itself a magnitude, distinguished from the related magnitudes by this, that a change in it is followed by a change of the ratio, whereas the ratio is unaffected by the change of both its sides, and remains the same so long as the exponent is not changed. Consequently, in place of 2 to 4 we can put 3 to 6 without changing the ratio, as the exponent 2 remains the same in both cases. The two sides of the ratio are still immediate quanta, and the qualitative and quantitative characteristics still external to one another. But in their truth, seeing that the quantitative itself in its externality is relation to self, or seeing that the independence and the indifference of the character are combined, it is measure. Thus quantity, by means of the dialectical movement, so far studied through its several stages, turned out to be a return to the quality. The first notion of quantity presented to us was that of quality abrogated and absorbed. That is to say, quantity seemed an external character, not identical with being, to which it is quite immaterial. This notion, as we have seen, underlines the mathematical definition of magnitude as what can be increased or diminished. At first sight, this distinction may create the impression that quantity is merely whatever can be altered, increase and diminution alike implying determination of magnitude otherwise, and may tend to confuse it with determinate being. The second stage of quality, which in its notion is similarly conceived as alterable, we can however complete the definition by adding that in quantity we have an alterable which in spite of alterations still remains the same. The notion of quantity, it thus turns out, implies an inherent contradiction. This contradiction is what forms the dialectic of quantity. The result of the dialectic, however, is not a mere return to quality, as if that were the true and quantity the false notion, but an advance to the unity and truth of both, to qualitative quantity or measure. It may be well, therefore, at this point to observe that whenever in our study of the objective world we are engaged in quantitative determinations, it is in all cases measure. It is in all cases measure which we have in view as the goal of our operations. This is hinted at even in language, when the ascertainment of quantitative features and relations is called measuring. We measure, for example, the length of different chords that have been put into a state of vibration, with an eye to the qualitative difference of the tones caused by their vibration, corresponding to this difference of length. Similarly, in chemistry we try to ascertain the quantity of the matters brought into combination, in order to find out the measures or proportions conditioning such combinations, that is to say, those quantities which give rise to definite qualities. In statistics, too, the numbers with which the study is engaged are important only from the qualitative results conditioned by them. Mere collection of numerical facts, prosecuted without regard to ends here noted, is justly called an exercise of idle curiosity, of neither theoretical nor practical interest. C. Measure. Measure is the qualitative quantum, in the first place as immediate, a quantum to which a determinate being or a quality is attached. Measure, where quality and quantity are in one, is thus the completion of being. Being, as we first apprehend it, is something utterly abstract and characterless, but it is in its very essence of being to characterise itself, and its complete characterisation is reached in measure. Measure, like the other stages of being, may serve as a definition of the absolute. God, it has been said, is the measure of all things. It is this idea which forms the ground note of many of the ancient Hebrew hymns, in which the glorification of God tends in the main to show that He is appointed to everything its bound, to the sea and the solid land, to the rivers and mountains, and also to the various kinds of plants and animals. To the religious sense of the Greeks, the divinity of measure, especially in respect to the social elites, was represented by Nemesis. The concept implies a general theory that all human things, riches, honour and power, as well as joy and pain, have their definite measure, the transgression of which brings ruin and destruction. In the world of objects, too, we have measure. We see in the first place existences in nature, of which measure forms the essential structure. This is the case, for example, with the solar system, which may be described as the realm of free measure. As we next proceed to the study of inorganic nature, measure retires, as it were, into the background. At least we often find the quantitative and qualitative characteristics showing indifference to each other. Thus, the quality of a rock or a river is not tied to a definite magnitude. But even these objects, when closely inspected, are found not to be quite measureless. The water of a river and the single constituents of rock, when chemically analysed, are seen to be qualities conditioned by quantitative ratios between the matters they contain. In organic nature, however, measure again rises into immediate perception. The various kinds of plants and animals, in the whole as well as in their parts, have a certain measure, though it is worth noticing that the more imperfect forms, those which are least removed from inorganic nature, are partly distinguished from the higher forms by the greater indefiniteness of their measure. Thus, among fossils, we find some ammonites discernible only by the microscope, and others as large as a cartwheel. The same vagueness of measure appears in several plants, which stand on a low level of organic development, for instance, ferns. Insofar as in measure, quality and quantity are only in immediate unity, to that extent their difference presents itself in a manner equally immediate. Two cases are then possible. Either the specific quantum or measure is a bare quantum, and the definite being, there and then, is capable of an increase or a diminution, without measure, which to that extent is a rule, being thereby set completely aside, or the alteration of the quantum is also an alteration of the quality. The identity between quantity and quality, which is found in measure, is at first only implicit and not yet explicitly realised. In other words, these two categories which unite in measure each claim an independent authority. On the one hand, the quantitative features of existence may be altered without affecting its quality. On the other hand, this increase and diminution, immaterial though it be, has its limit, by exceeding which the quality suffers change. Thus the temperature of water is, in the first place, a point of no consequence in respect to its liquidity. Still, with the increase or diminution of the temperature of liquid water, there comes a point where the state of cohesion suffers a qualitative change, and the water is converted into steam or ice. A quantitative change takes place apparently without any further significance, but there is something lurking behind, and a seemingly innocent change of quantity acts as a kind of snare to catch hold of the quality. The antinomy of measure, which this implies, was exemplified under more than one garb among the Greeks. It was asked, for example, whether a single grain makes a heap of wheat, or whether it makes a bald tail to tear out a single hair from the horse's tail. At first, no doubt, looking at the nature of quantity as an indifferent and external character of being, we are disposed to answer these questions in the negative, and yet we must admit this indifferent increase and diminution has its limit. A point is finally reached where a single additional grain makes a heap of wheat, and the bald tail is produced if we continue plucking out single hairs. These examples find a parallel in the story of the peasant, who, as his ass trudged carefully along, went on adding ounce after ounce to its load, till at length it sunk under the unendurable burden. It would be a mistake to treat these examples as pedantic futility. They really turn on thoughts, an acquaintance with which is of great importance in practical life, especially in ethics. Thus, in the matter of expenditure, there is a certain latitude within which a more or less does not matter. But when the measure imposed by the individual circumstances of the special case is exceeded on the one side or the other, the qualitative nature of measure, as in the above example in the different temperature of water, makes itself felt, and a course which a moment before was held good economy turns into avarice or prodigality. The same principle may be applied in politics, when the constitution of a state has to be looked at as independent of, no less than dependent on, the extent of its territory, the number of its inhabitants, and other quantitative points of the same kind. If we look, for example, at a state with a territory of 10,000 square miles and a population of 4 millions, we should, without hesitation, admit that a few square miles of land or a few thousand inhabitants more or less exercise no essential influence on the character of its constitution. But on the other hand, we must not forget that by a continual increase or diminishing of a state, we finally get to a point where, apart from all other circumstances, this quantitative alteration alone necessarily draws with an alteration in the quality of the constitution. The constitution of a little Swiss canton does not suit a great kingdom. And similarly, the constitution of the Roman Republic was unsuitable when transferred to the small imperial towns of Germany. In this case, when a measure through its quantitative nature has gone in excess of its qualitative character, we meet what is at first an absence of measure, the measureless. But seeing that the second quantitative ratio, which in comparison with the first is measureless, is none the less qualitative, the measureless is also a measure. These two transitions, from quality to quantum, and from the latter back again to quality, may be represented under the image of an infinite progression, the self-abrogation and restoration of measure in the measureless. Quantity, as we have seen, is not only capable of alteration, i.e. of increase or diminution, it is naturally and necessarily a tendency to exceed itself. This tendency is maintained even in measure. But if the quality present in measure exceeds a certain limit, the quality corresponding to it is also put in abeyance. This, however, is not a negation of the quality altogether, but only the definite quality, the place of which is at once occupied by another. This process of measure, which appears alternately as a mere change in quantity and as a sudden revulsion of quantity into quality, must be envisaged under the figure of a nodal, knotted line. Such lines we find in nature under a variety of forms. We have already referred to the qualitatively different states of aggregation water exhibits under increase or diminution of temperature. The same phenomenon is present by the different degrees in the oxidation of metals. Even the difference of musical notes may be regarded as an example of what takes place in the process of measure, the revulsion from what is at first merely quantitative into qualitative alteration. What really takes place here is that the immediacy, which still attaches to measure as such, is set aside. In measure at first, quality and quantity itself are immediate, and measure is only their relative identity. But measure shows itself absorbed and superseded in the measureless. Yet the measureless, although it be the negation of measure, is itself a unity of quantity and quality. Thus in the measureless, the measure is still seen to meet only with itself. Instead of the more abstract factors, being and nothing, some and other, etc., the infinite, which is affirmation as negation of negation, now finds factors in quality and quantity. These have in the first place passed over quality into quantity, and quantity into quality, and thus are both shown up as negations. But in their unity, that is, in measure, they are originally distinct, and one is only through the instrumentality of the other. And after the immediacy of this unity has turned out to be self-annulling, the unity is explicitly put as what it implicitly is, simple relation to self, which contains in it being in all its forms absorbed. Being, or immediacy, which by the negation of itself is a mediation with self and a reference to self, which consequently is also a mediation which cancels itself into reference to self or immediacy, is essence. The process of measure, instead of being only the wrong infinite of an endless progression, in the shape of an ever recurrent recoil from quality to quantity and from quantity to quality, is also the true infinity of coincidence with self in another. In measure, quality and quantity originally confront each other like some and other. But quality is implicitly quantity, and conversely quantity is implicitly quality. In the process of measure, therefore, these two pass into each other. Each of them becomes what it already was implicitly, and thus we get being thrown into abeyance and absorbed, with its several characteristics negatived. Such being is essence. Measure is implicitly essence, and its process consists in realizing what it is implicitly. The ordinary consciousness conceives things as being, and studies them in quality, quantity, and measure. These immediate characteristics, however, soon show themselves to be not fixed but transient, and essence is the result of their dialectic. In the sphere of essence, one category does not pass into another, but refers to another merely, and being the form of reference is purely due to our reflection on what takes place, but it is special and proper characteristic of essence. In the sphere of being, when somewhat becomes another, the somewhat has vanished. Not so in essence. Here there is no real other, but only diversity, reference of the one to its other. The transition of essence is therefore at the same time no transition. For in the passage of different into different, the different does not vanish. The different terms remain in their relation. When we speak of being and not, being is independent, so is not. The case is otherwise with the positive and negative. No doubt these possess the characteristics of being and not, but the positive by itself has no sense. It is wholly in reference to the negative. And it is the same with the negative. In the sphere of being, the reference of one term to another is only implicit. In essence, on the contrary, it is explicit. And this, in general, is the distinction between the forms of being and essence. In being, everything is immediate. In essence, everything is relative. End of Part 2 of Chapter 7. Recording by Ryan Smallwood.